All right. Welcome and thank you for joining. My name is Ashley Lusick, and I am a health educator for community health at Atlantic Health System. Today's webinar, Leaders in the Anti-Violence Movement, is presented by Jill Zinkgraf. Before we begin, I have a few announcements. This webinar is being recorded. All participants are muted. If you have a question, please use the Q&A for questions or the chat for comments. We will try and get through all questions at the end of the presentation. Are you or a loved one interested in smoking cessation? Atlantic Health System offers a free quit smoking program. This program includes an individual assessment, free nicotine replacement products, and 6 weekly group meetings to help you quit and stay smoke free. There are multiple dates and times available, with groups available in person or virtually. For more information about these groups and other resources, or for additional dates and times, please call 1-844-472-8499. I am now going to turn it over to Jill.
Thank you, Ashley, and hello, everyone. Let me share my screen and play from start. Okay, so welcome, everyone, and I'm so excited to be here. And so today we're going to look at reflecting back and looking forward and talk about some of the leadership in the interpersonal anti-violence movement. But before I tell you a little bit about myself, I wanted to take this opportunity to just say that some of the stuff we're going to talk about is really hard to talk about. And so if you are triggered by anything that I am saying, or you need a moment to walk away, please do so and take good care of yourself. I'm not sure how the hospital has it set up, but you can call our hotline at any time. It's 908-453-4181 to talk to a trained counselor. And so now we'll move on. Hello, and my name is Jill Zinkgraf. Recently, about 3 years ago, I got my doctorate in organizational leadership, and I have been involved in the interpersonal violence movement, which started as the Battered Women's Movement for a little over 40 years now. Currently, I serve as the executive director of the Domestic Abuse Sexual Assault Crisis Center of Warren County. And most of my focus in both my volunteer and in my professional career has been interpersonal violence. And interestingly, I was telling Ashley, I also serve on the National Women's History Alliance Board of Trustees. And they're the group of women 42 years ago that started Women's History Month. And so it's really an honor to be here and to do this work alongside all of you. So just a couple of objectives. Oh, I see someone put something in the chat. Just a couple of objectives before we get started. I put 3 here, and you can put in the chat if you have any questions or want to know something or dive a little deeper into something we talk about. But to understand the historical perspective of the interpersonal violence movement and its importance to what we do today. How did we get here? Understand how misogyny is institutionalized in our culture, and identify ways to combat interpersonal violence, reflecting on each of our respective roles and the importance of those roles, because each of us has a role to play. And so a quick question. I just want you to think about it. In what year was the ERA ratified? And the ERA is the Equal Rights Amendment. And so what it stated was equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. And so I want you to think about in what year was the ERA ratified? In what year was there an amendment to the Constitution of the United States? And so a lot of times when I ask this question, and I will share that it was written in 1923. And so we are coming up on the 100th anniversary of the ERA. And so a lot of times I'll hear it was in the 1920s, 1950s, 60s, 70s. Sometimes people will go as far as the 1980s. But if your answer was anything other than it was never ratified, that answer would have been wrong. And so one of my favorite quotes by Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, if I could choose an amendment to add to the Constitution, it would be the Equal Rights Amendment. I think we've achieved through legislation, but legislation can be repealed. And we're seeing this, right, everyone? You are seeing this. It can be altered. So I would like my granddaughters, when they pick up the Constitution, to see that notion that women and men are persons of equal stature. I'd like them to see that as a basic principle of our society. And so the problem is that it was never ratified. And the bigger problem is that so many people don't know that. And so one of the things I really encourage people to do is to know what's happening, particularly politically, because as rights are chipped away, remember, they can be repealed. And think about how hard people have worked to get those rights. And would it surprise you to know that less than 40% of American women that can vote actually vote? Only 40% are voting. That's a very low number. And so our voice is so very important. This is one of the ways in which we can do it. And so, interestingly, the anti-violence movement has started very long ago, even before Carrie Nation. But I wanted to share Carrie Nation because she was an interesting person. She was also referred to as Hatchet Granny. And the original movement or prohibition movement was called the temperance movement. And Carrie's first husband was a batterer. He would get drunk, come home from the bars, and then beat her and her children. And what she would do is she would start going to these bars and start destroying them with this hatchet. And so this temperance movement, she really got people started, and prohibition began well after she had passed away, January 17th in 1920. But she really started the anti-violence movement, believe it or not, using violence, interestingly, back in the early 1900s. After prohibition, not a lot happened. When prohibition ended, we entered into war. We went through the 50s, and then the 1960s and 70s is really where I'm going to start, because this is where you start seeing an explosion in movements. And I want you to think about what was happening in the 1960s. There was a cultural revolution, a sexual revolution, because the Comstock Act was lifted, which prohibited the use of birth control. You had an anti-war revolution, an inner city revolution in the development of social welfare. You had Stonewall, which was the gay rights movement. You had the civil rights movement. And what happened was, in the early 70s, white suburban women, because the 1950s and 60s, you kind of saw what they called white flight and the explosion of the suburbs. White suburban women saw what was happening in the gay rights and civil rights movements, and they saw that they were gaining momentum. And so they looked at how that was being organized. And for the first time, you saw what we called the battered women's movement. All through the United States, women were banding together, demanding equality, but specifically demanding that rape and battery stop. And so what developed from that is what we call the underground. Ms. Magazine, for the first time, called it. And this magazine came out and went across the United States like wildfire. And what was happening was, because there were no laws, women would take their children and escape into what they called the underground. And the underground started in women's homes, where they would take women and children and move them across state lines in hiding until they got to a destination where they would change their name, social security number. So these were women that would take their children and literally were running for their lives. And that's what you often hear when you when we would talk about battered women, you would see the black eye and women running for their lives. A lot of that has changed, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But the underground started to develop these networks, and these networks of people through the whole United States would take women and children, particularly children, who judges would give custody to the person who was causing the harm, and they would run. And so from there were a couple of very big cases that sparked national controversy. And one is Frances Hughes. There was a movie and a book about this case called The Burning Bed, but I wanted to share what happened that night, March 9th, 1977. And I'm looking up and down because I have it written out. And so I'm going to read a little bit about it, because what happened was, for the very first time, because there was no escape unless you went into the underground, the only way out was to kill the person causing the harm. And so an interesting statistic is that there are still women serving life sentences back from the 70s for killing the person that was hurting them, because there was no option. And so Francine, or Frances, returned from her secretarial course on March 9th, 1977 in the afternoon. She found her husband, Mickey, intoxicated, and he was angry, as he often became. He refused to allow her to make food for their children and berated her for some time about quitting school, wanted her to quit school. And she really needed this because she needed a job. He began to physically abuse her, and the police came and spoke to them. But often what would happen is they would tell someone, why don't you go to the bar, have a couple beers, come back when you're calmer, and then figure this out. And so the police came and they spoke. They refused to arrest Mickey because he did not assault her in front of the police, and they had to see it. She again attempted to make dinner for herself and her children, and Mickey swept the food onto the floor. He forced her to the floor, bending her arm back behind her, and made her clean the mess with her hands. When she finished, he dumped out the trash can on the floor and forced her to clean it again. After he forced her to cook his dinner, he then raped her. That night, she made the decision that the only way out was to burn the house down. And so she put her 4 children in the car. She lit gas around Mickey, who was passed out on the bed. She lit it on fire and drove off. And so for the first time in United States history, they used the defense of PTSD and battered women syndrome, and that she was found not guilty by reason of temporary insanity. Now, this was really important because that hadn't happened. And what that brought was national attention to the problem. And all of a sudden, people started talking about it. And so the underground continued, but it became more prevalent until 1983. And Tracy Thurman, who filed complaints against her husband, Buck, many, many times. And Buck was arrested, but he was released within an hour, 2 hours. He would sober up and he would come back and he would come after Tracy. And on June 10th, 1983, Buck assaulted Tracy for the last time. He stabbed her 13 times in the chest, neck, shoulders, and face, which occurred 10 minutes after she called the police. Kicked her in the head with a booted foot. He snatched up their 2-year-old and told the child, "I've killed your rotten mother," and then left her lying in a pool of blood. It took 25 minutes for the police to arrive. So what was interesting about this case was that for the first time, a private citizen sued the police department. And in her legal suit, she claimed that it was a violation of her constitutional right, the 14th right, that said that the state will not deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, or deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of those laws. Now, that was really important. She won. And they awarded Tracy $2.3 million in compensatory damages. But let me just say this, Tracy spent the rest of her life, suffering from those 13 wounds. She was disabled and worked on changing a lot of those laws. Interestingly, because of this lawsuit, the number of domestic violence assaults reported increased in 1 year by 92%. That's just in the first 12 months of this lawsuit. And so that started to gain more national attention and momentum. In 1985, C. Everett Koop, who was the Attorney Surgeon General at the time, said that the leading cause of injury to women, more than muggings, car accidents, and rapes combined, was domestic violence. And so he said this in front of a Senate hearing. And he said, on average, and this is back in 1985, 20 people are basically abused by an intimate partner every minute, meaning more than 10 million survivors annually. It is estimated that 25% of the nation's population is currently being abused. On a typical day, more than 20,000 phone calls were coming in to hotlines all over the United States. And that the presence of a gun increased domestic violence risk of homicide by 500%. And that only 32% of those injured actually sought out medical attention. And so for the first time ever, we had what was called the Prevention of Domestic Violence Act of 1991. Prior to 1991, or what we call the PDVA, DV was handled as a family matter. The victim had to agree to press charges. The court process was long and complicated. Police often, their hands were tied because if they didn't see it, it wasn't for them to do anything. And there was very little training for police officers on domestic violence. However, with the PDVA, it declared that domestic violence was a serious act against society. So for the first time, people were saying this out loud and actually had the law to say it. There are thousands of people in New Jersey who are regularly beaten, tortured, and in some cases killed by their spouses. A significant number of women who are attacked are pregnant, and on and on. And so the PDVA gave roots or teeth, if you will, to the work that we were doing. And so it defined what domestic violence was, and it established protective orders, mandatory arrest, and mandatory domestic violence training for all police officers. Now, let me just say this. Interestingly, the first couple of years of the PDVA, mortality rates went up. And you say, well, why is that? Well, a big part of the problem was that, yes, we had mandatory arrest, which a lot of people would say was great. The problem is that if a police officer came to the site where the domestic took place, and that one person showed signs of injury, and they would then arrest that person, how long did they hold them for? A few hours, overnight? And then when released, he would just be angrier. There were no follow-up services or opportunity because we weren't part of that process working in the field. And so what happened was next time it occurred, she just wouldn't call because there were no other options. And then if you were a woman if you were a woman of color, you weren't calling the police because they were already violent towards Black men or men of color. And so we saw mortality rates those first few years go up. And so in 1994, the Violence Against Women Act came through. And what that did is it legitimized the work that we in the victim services side, not the criminal justice side, do. So that now the underground now had legs because they pumped $1.6 billion into the field. And so it allowed for agencies to then do their work with dollars. And what that established was what we call core services. And so the Violence Against Women Act, really, for the work that I've always done in this field, it's kind of been my Bible. It's been the guiding principle for this work. And a few things that it states is that all services are free and confidential. Because what happened to Francis and Tracy, right? They didn't have the ability to go someplace and receive free and confidential services. And so what we know to be true is that for so many families who are impacted, is that they need to keep that secret. And then that secret's really important. And so if you come and you talk to any one of us, we don't tell your secret. And in fact, the confidentiality surpasses the death of the survivor of that violence. And so only a judge can subpoena the information. And even then, we can quash that information. And we do that because one of the most important things of the anti-violence movement, or the interpersonal violence anti-violence movement, is I need to know everything. Because how else, and there's only a couple tools we're given to put in our tool belt. And so we call those our core services. And so in New Jersey, all counties under Christine Todd Whitman, all counties have the DV, or domestic violence, or sexual violence crisis center. Some of the counties, these programs are housed separately. In Warren County, they're both housed under one roof, which I think we call the dual programming. It's so much better because in 85% of the cases where there's domestic violence, there's sexual violence. And so what we're able to offer in these core services is crisis intervention, which is emergency shelter, hotline, and response teams that go to hospitals and police departments and meet survivors and give them options. And what I told you about Francis and Tracy is that they didn't have the opportunity to meet with people. And so the isolation and alienation was tremendous. So in a reduction of those barriers, what we say is for every person who goes to the police department or hospital has the opportunity to meet with an advocate from the victim service side, not the criminal justice side. And that person serves as their advocate between all the complex systems. One of the things that we say a lot is that our job in the victim service field is to understand what are the barriers, what is preventing people from coming forward. And so we're able to offer the crisis intervention, counseling, and legal advocacy to connect people into services. And even within those services, we have subsets of those services. So for example, in our counseling department, we have people specifically for the LGBTQIA plus community, mental health, vulnerable populations, including elder abuse, deaf and hard of hearing. And so all these core services are intact. And every couple of years, you'll see that what they call the VAWA Act of 1994 is up for renewal. And so it's so important that we get those dollars continuously filtered into the system. And so we know at any time if VAWA is not renewed, that some of these core services can go away. So in 2016, and interestingly, if you are a survivor of sexual violence, you do not qualify for a protective order under the domestic violence law because there is no established relationship. Now, social media has been really interesting and kind of the hookup, I'm calling the hookup culture, with the advent of all these dating online sites. And so what would happen was if someone was sexually assaulted from someone that they met through one of these dating apps and couldn't establish a relationship, they didn't qualify for a protective order. So it could have been through a college campus, it could be through a dating site, could be through an acquaintance that you know, but there was no established relationship. So beginning May 2016, the Sex Assault Survivors Protection Act, or SASPA, came into effect. And so that was a big win for the movement because it provided protective orders where there was a gap in services. At the same time and around the same time, Me Too movement started gaining momentum. But believe it or not, the Me Too movement and Tarana Burke started in 2006 through a social media site called MySpace. And what Tarana said is an exchange of empathy provides an entry point for a lot of people to see what healing feels like. Social media is not a safe space. When one person says, yeah, me too, it gives permission for others to open up. And so from 2006 to 2017, Tarana did a lot of work behind the scenes of gaining momentum behind the Me Too movement. But what really catapulted the Me Too movement was the Harvey Weinstein case. And Alyssa Milano, doing the hashtag Me Too. And not only did it gain national attention, it really gained international attention. And what happened is that for the first time, particularly women of color were able to find a network of people that they could count on and that they found comfort in similar stories. And so the Me Too movement, which is still gaining momentum, both nationally and internationally, has held people accountable. And they have their own website now. I encourage you to look at it. But what I wanted to share is that even with all of that, there is a long road ahead. Because what I would share with all of you is that ideologically, we are really comfortable with violence against women. And we are comfortable with male violence. And we see this often. Because what I would challenge you to think about is how else can you explain these numbers that I'm just about to give you? And these statistics have not changed since the 1970s. And they're not my numbers. They're the FBI numbers, which is a male-dominated organization. A typical day, we're still receiving over 20,000 hotline calls. More than 10 million women and men annually are abused. 1/4 of the women and 1/9 of all men have been severely abused. 1 in 10 women are raped. 1 in 15 children are exposed to the violence. The cost to the United States economy is $8.3 billion annually. And there's more than 8 million days of productivity lost to violence. Now, those numbers tell a story. So if 1 out of 4, and every day we are burying if we're burying 3 of our fellow sisters every day to violence since the 1970s, if that number hasn't changed, what needs to change? And so part of the problem is that I believe we have to think differently. And one of the things in the movement, I'm telling you, if I had $1 every time somebody said to me, why does she stay? I would be a very wealthy person. I want you to think about all the questions, and often I'll hear, why does she stay? Why doesn't she leave? Is it really that bad? Because if it was, she would leave. What did she do? Right? They want to know what the violence is. But he's such a nice person. Are you sure? You're not misunderstanding that. The only thing you should be asking, the only question is, why does he hit her? Because it's against the law. And so one of the things is that we have to look at what is the root of the problem. And the root of the problem is the violence. But the problem is agencies like mine, we only have a couple things in our tool belt. We have counseling, certainly, but for crisis intervention, we have an emergency shelter, but how long are you staying there? And we have what we call safety planning. And so remember I told you, one of the things that VAWA allows for is that everything you tell me, I get to keep confidential. And I need that information so that I can understand how to best serve you and give you a plan so that if the violence happens again, what you can do. But that puts the onus of responsibility back on the person that's being harmed. It's no different than when we teach children between good touch and bad touch. If they don't say anything, then they are blamed for not speaking up. But they're not the problem. The person causing the harm is the problem. And so that's the root of the problem. And so I often say we need to think differently. And so what does that look like? Right? And so one of the things is that we believe, we support, we let people know that they're not alone and that there are options and there is help. One of the things that we work really hard on is that in the movement, the anti-violence movement, we work with the survivor, but we don't work with the whole family. And what I can share with you in the work that I do is that more than 50% of the people that come through DASACC's doors are going back to the person that's causing them harm for many, many reasons, including they love them, that's their family. The person causing harm doesn't want to really cause harm. That's not how this works. But if we're only treating part of the whole, then what are we doing? And we're not reaching some people because they think if they come through our doors that they have to leave that person that's causing harm. And so remember what I said about barriers. Our role is really to reduce those barriers. And so if we know that families, and quite frankly, just so everyone knows, very rarely, even as a person causing harm, do they lose custody of their children. So if we're not treating the whole family, what are we doing? Particularly if the family wants the whole family treated. And so a couple other ways that are really important and that we look at is there's a very big volunteer program. We work with a lot of volunteers that go out into the community and able to reduce some of the barriers, particularly in communities that are marginalized, that maybe don't have all the information and or we're not in those pockets. And so the other thing that's really important that I want to leave you with, that I think is really, really the thing that the tool that you can put in your tool belt is just as an individual, when you hear something or see something, the very next thing that you say makes the difference whether that person can trust you or not. So if someone is brave enough to confide in you that they're in a situation or that there is a problem or that they're scared or something may not be right, if you say, "Are you sure?" or "Just leave," they'll never come back to you. But if you say, "Tell me how I can help you," or "What do you need from me?" or "How can I be a support system?" you change the trajectory of what happens next. And so what I love about my job and have always loved about my job is my only role is to believe survivors. It's the only thing I have to do. I'm not there to prove or disprove what they told me. And so that's the best part of the job, is that that's really where the healing begins, because perhaps for the first time, somebody believes them and doesn't look to them as the problem. And I think that if everybody just did that one time, the whole world potentially could change just 1 degree on its axis. And imagine how different this would look. If what we were talking about wasn't that we were burying 3 women every day to this violence, but rather 3 women were empowering their children, right? And families were healing and moving forward, would be such a better statistic. Because what the argument is, and women have said, and Eve Ensler, who wrote the Vagina Monologue, said that women spend half their life worrying about the violence, and then the other half of their life healing from that violence. Imagine what we could be doing if that wasn't the case. And so there are a lot of people in the movement doing this work. And my hope is that each person we touch then touches one person, and we start shifting that view. And so with that, I open it up to some questions. I know that.
Well, thank you so much, Jill, for all of that information. And I'm not seeing any more questions at this time. So I'd like to say to those participants, thank you for joining today. We kindly ask that you take a few minutes after today's webinar to complete the program survey. The link to the survey has also been added to the chat for your convenience. And a special thank you to Jill for dedicating your time and expertise today. And if you have any additional questions or comments, you can always send an email to communityhealth@atlantichealth.org or call 1-844-472-8499. That concludes today's webinar, and thank you all so much for joining.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.